Hello, art students. We're going to be creating value scales today. A value scale shows the full range of lightness and darkness within a single color, and in this instance, it will be a grayscale. There are several different techniques to create values with graphite. One involves using more or less pressure, and one involves massing. So to get started, we're going to make 4 rectangles, and inside each of those rectangles, we want to have 5 boxes because we're going to create 5 different values today using each of these techniques. The first technique that we're going to practice today is blending. This would also be considered shading. And to create values with shading, we really are talking about 2 things: adjusting the pressure that we use and using different densities of pencil lead. So to create the darkest value, I need to do 2 things: use lots of pressure, and I need to use a really soft pencil lead. The softer the pencil lead, the darker the value. The harder I press down, the darker the value. I'm using a tight circular motion with my pencil, and I'm holding it at an angle so that I'm using as much of the pencil lead as I can. And I'm holding my hand in a tripod position. So I'm gonna remember what that felt like in my hand, and then just relax my fingers, relax my hand, and loosen up a little bit. Maybe hold my fingers a little bit farther back from the tip of the pencil so I can keep that pressure lighter. And I'm using those tight circular motions to create the next value. So I want something that's noticeably lighter than the darkest value. To create the next lightest value, I can continue working with that 6B and just really lighten up, or I can switch to something like a 4B or a 2B, which is what I have here. And then I'm just going to ease up again, lighten up with the pressure that I'm using, and I'm going to make sure that I'm also working in more than one direction with those tight circles. And using the full length of the pencil lead, not just the tip of the pencil. So again, I'm looking for something that's noticeably lighter so that there's a clear distinction in values. Now I need to create something that's kind of in between white and this middle gray. So I'm going to switch up to a 2H or an HB. I could stay with a B or a 2B for this value if I wanted to. I would just have to be really careful and go really light. If I work with an H pencil, I can layer my values because I'm not at risk of getting too dark too quickly. So that's why I'm going to stick with that particular pencil. And then I can add more if I need to. So I'm just looking for something that's in between the white and the middle gray. And that looks pretty good. So I want to see a clear distinction. If I need to go back in and add a little bit more, I can always do that. I can layer those values. And there you have it. There's my blending. Now I'm going to create some values by massing my lines using hatch marks. Hatch marks are lines that go in one direction, and it's a fast kind of flicking line. It's not an intentional, deliberate, straight, methodical line. It's a flick, and we're piling those lines together to create our values, and we're applying pressure. So the more closely I mass these lines together and overlap them, the darker they will appear, and then the softer the pencil lead, the darker those lines will be. So I'm going to add a little bit more, go back in and mass a little bit more to make that darker. Now I'm going to switch pencils here so that I can continue massing the lines, but I can get lighter. So I'm going to use a harder pencil lead, and then go down to an HB or a 2H for that final value so that again I can really mask these lines and overlap them. And what that does, that masking does, is it creates the illusion of gray because I've clumped those lines so closely together. Next, I'm going to use cross-hatching marks to create values. And cross-hatching is just like hatching, but you're going in two directions. So you're starting in one direction and then you're going over those lines in the opposite direction, kind of like a mesh screen. So it's the same principle. The more closely you pile up those lines, the darker they appear, and the softer the pencil lead you use as you're massing those lines together, the darker they will appear. For my final technique, I'm going to use a scribble. But really, when it comes to creating values by massing lines, you can use any kind of mark making. You could create values by massing dots or stars or circles, anything you wanted to, by applying the same principle. So we've created a nice range of values. Now we want to learn how to blend those values so that there's a gradual transition. So create 3 more rectangular boxes. And if it's helpful to you, you can lightly sketch in some little lines like you did for the value scales, just so you kind of know what to put where. We're going to start with that darkest value. We're going to use blending. This time we're also going to use something called a blending stump. And we're going to start with the 6B pencil and use nice tight circles. But the goal for a gradation is to gradually create transitions from light to dark with no hard edges. So what I'm going to start to do is lighten up the pressure now with my pencil, using that 6B again as I work to the left, and then continuously lighten up as I travel to the left with those tight circles and overlap those areas. Maybe go back in and add a little bit more because I really want to create that smooth transition. So I'm going to go over some of those areas and with a lighter touch. Now I'm going to switch pencils to a 4B and lighten up the pressure. I'm going to do a little bit of overlapping with my tight circles and lighten up as I travel to the left. Now I'm going to switch to a B or a 2B. And as I move to the left, I am getting lighter with my pressure. I'm going to maybe go back over some of these areas with a 6B, but really, really light touch with that 6B, just to kind of smooth out some of those transitions before I go in with my HB pencil to add the final value, overlapping with the one I left off with. So you can see I've got this really nice transition from dark to light. Now let's see what happens if I use that blending stump. A blending stump is a tightly wrapped piece of paper. And to use it, you're going to work in a tight circle, starting with the darkest values and then making your way to the left with your lightest values. So what the paper does is kind of like what you would do with your finger, where you're just taking the graphite that's there but you're burnishing it by rubbing it. And as you rub it and burnish it, you're smoothing out the graphite and moving it a little bit to the left. So I'm going to wipe that off on a piece of scratch paper to remove some of the graphite before I go in to the really, really light side of my value scale. I'm going to wipe it down one more time. So you can see what that does. It also removes some of the texture that we saw in the darker valued areas. So I'm going to take another pass with it. So a blending stump is really going to create a really, really smooth finish to your blending. So we're going to do 2 of these gradations using this particular blending technique, and then you're going to pick another technique of your choice using massing. So here's what that gradation looks like with cross-hatching. Now we've got our value scales and we've got our gradations.